So here's the deal. Senator Chris Van Golland just flew to El Salvador to check on Kilmar Armando Abrego García, the Maryland father who was, well, illegally deported.
Yep. And it's really quite something that he was like denied a face-to-face meeting with Garcia, right?
Exactly. The senator wanted to make sure Garcia was still alive, which is a huge concern given the whole deportation mishap.
Definitely. I'm curious though, what's the whole background story on Garcia? Wasn't he mistakenly deported?
Right, Garcia was deported by mistake, and there's zero evidence linking him to any criminal activity like, say, MS-13 membership. The only thing thrown around was that he was wearing some Bulls merch, and an unnamed witness speculated about his gang
Yeah, that
ties.
sounds pretty flimsy. And so the US courts basically said there's no evidence to back up those allegations, correct?
Exactly. The U.S. courts have made it clear there's no proof he's part of MS-13, no criminal record, just a record of a minor offense, like a traffic ticket back in 2017.
But then why is Garcia still being held in that so-called SECOT, isn't it?
Yes, he's in the SECOT, a containment terrorism center, which sounds, well, extremely harsh. And get this, the Salvadorian vice president was quoted saying that Garcia is being held because the Trump administration is paying El Salvador like $25,000 a year per person they send over, even though Garcia doesn't fit the typical profile of a dangerous criminal.
Right? That's mind-boggling. So in essence, both sides, El Salvador and the Trump administration, are allegedly expanding their executive powers while denying due process?
Exactly. It's like this twisted game of power where both the Salvadorian government and the U.S. Trump administration, by their own moves, are ignoring court orders. There was even a Supreme Court order mandating the facilitation of his return to the U.S., which seems to be completely defied.
That's really alarming. And wasn't there something about the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador not giving any directions to help with his release?
Yes, exactly that. The embassy said they've received no directives. So it raises the question, why is Garcia still being imprisoned in those conditions, especially with the American court clearly stating he deserves due process?
Yep. It almost sounds like they're treating him like a political pawn, doesn't it?
Totally. And on top of that, there's been a lot of debate around due process. Some folks bring up the idea that immigrants might not get as rigorous a process as American citizens facing something like the death penalty. But that argument gets twisted pretty quickly into justifying extreme measures.
Yeah, and then there's J.D. Vance's meltdown on Twitter, which really adds more fuel to the fire.
Right? J.D. Vance, during his Twitter thread, basically lashed out, claiming that anyone disagreeing with him must be either dumb or immoral. And he flipped the narrative by arguing about due process in a way that seems to muddy the waters even more.
I heard that. It was wild. I gotta ask, though, how do we reconcile the fact that on one hand, we have a case of mistaken deportation, and on the other, these politicians using it to expand their control?
Good point. I think it's essentially about power dynamics. You see, the senator's visit was meant as a check on what's happening to Garcia, a man who, by all legal standards, should be granted due process. But instead, we end up seeing both the Trump administration and the Salvadorian government playing a dangerous game of denying reality to suit their political agendas.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a political tug of war where the rights of an individual get trampled over for broader power plays.
Absolutely. It's reminiscent of how sometimes policies that are meant to secure borders end up undermining fundamental rights. And there's this disturbing point, the comment about Garcia being sent to what's essentially a slave labor or terror confinement center where conditions are brutal.
That's really concerning. And if you think about it, the whole thing with the alleged payment arrangement between Trump's administration and El Salvador almost looks like an incentive to keep such cases going. Don't you think?
Yeah, it's like when money enters the equation, the system is incentivized to maintain the status quo rather than doing what's just. This $25,000 per person per year is utterly, well, absurd when the individual's human rights are at stake.
Absolutely. And then we also have the Supreme Court's involvement, labeling the Trump administration's actions as defiance of court orders. It really shows the clash between executive overreach and the judiciary's mandate.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that while the Supreme Court is stepping in, both the US bureaucracy and the Salvadorian authorities aren't exactly aligning with those rulings. It's like a classic scenario of power struggling to balance itself out.
Now, one aspect I found intriguing was J.D. Vance's rhetoric. While some might argue he's, poking fun at his critics, isn't there a risk that his language ends up alienating people or muddying the real issues here?
That's a fair point. On one hand, his tone is self-assured, almost smug, which can irritate many. But on the other, it draws attention to a broader discomfort about how due process and executive power are being manipulated. I mean, he literally claims that if you disagree, you're either dumb or immoral. It's a pretty polarizing stance.
Yeah, I get that. And while some are attracted to the decisiveness of that language, it does seem to oversimplify, doesn't it? Especially when so many human lives and legal processes are involved.
Right. Oversimplification is the danger. As a society, we need to critically evaluate these claims rather than just following strong rhetoric. The case of Garcia isn't just a headline. It's about ensuring that our fundamental rights aren't sidelined by political maneuvering.
Absolutely. It really comes down to protecting individual rights, regardless of a person's status or the political agenda at play.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that when power gets too concentrated, even in the name of national security, it can end up trampling over due process. The senators attempt to get a glimpse of the truth by trying to visit Garcia is a poignant example of that tension.
Yep, that's the heart of the issue. So, in your view, this whole episode should trigger a broader discussion about the checks and balances in our government, especially in immigration and executive decisions.
Absolutely. It's a spark to get us talking about the way legal standards, like due process, must be upheld regardless of political convenience. When you see these executive powers creeping up unchecked, it's a red flag for democracy itself.
I totally agree. And isn't it also a call for more transparency? I mean, if there's no evidence and yet actions are taken, it makes it hard for anyone to trust the system.
Yes, it's like we're forced to rely on court orders and external pressure because the usual checks are being, disregarded. That lack of transparency just compounds the issue.
Yeah, exactly. It's a complex web of legal, political, and human rights issues all bundled together.
And that's what makes this episode so fascinating yet deeply troubling. The intersection of errors in deportation, flawed evidence, and overreaching executive actions creates a scenario that demands careful, critical, public scrutiny.
Absolutely. I'd say it's a wake-up call, not just about immigration policies, but about how power is exercised in our modern political landscape.
Right on. It reminds us to always question, to demand transparency, and to never let the system bypass the due process that every person is entitled to.
Yeah, well said. Thanks for breaking that down. There's a lot to digest here, and it clearly shows the importance of accountability on every level.